In the quiet heart of Clearwater Valley, where fog rolled over the hills like silk in the early dawn, there lay a stretch of land, wide, green, and untouched. For generations, it had belonged to one family, the Harlans. Tucked between two creeks and backed by a towering ridge, it was a piece of land that locals often called the Basin. To most, it was nothing more than empty countryside, but to Thomas Harland, it was legacy. It was soil his great-grandfather had plowed, the very earth his father had built a small dam upon to water their crops and maintain the family's private lake. When Thomas inherited it, he had no intention of selling. He was a quiet man, not fond of crowds or city noise. The Basin was solitude, memory, and peace, the only thing untouched by the encroaching development sprouting like weeds around Clearwater. Yet while Thomas cherished the land, others saw it differently. For the Clearwater Development Board, the Basin was prime real estate, an empty canvas ready to be filled with uniform houses, manicured lawns, and the promise of profit. When the Homeowners Association, or HOA, of Clearwater Ridge began expanding, they claimed their boundaries extended further than originally mapped. Paperwork was filed, maps were redrawn, and suddenly, the Basin wasn't Harland land anymore, not according to them. They moved fast. Surveyors appeared one spring morning, trucks followed by autumn, and by winter heavy machinery churned up the earth where Thomas's grandfather once fished. At first, Thomas believed it was a mistake. Boundaries couldn't shift overnight. He went to the county office only to find that somewhere in a pile of paperwork, the land had indeed been rezoned, not by him, but on his behalf. Signatures he didn't recognize carried his name. Legal notices were sent to an address he hadn't lived at in over a decade. By the time he pieced it all together, concrete had been poured. The HOA had built 35 homes, all identical, all standing on what was once Harlan soil. Each home sold quickly, drawing in young families with promises of lake views and exclusive community rights. But the lake wasn't theirs. It belonged to Thomas, or at least the dam that created it did. Hidden deep in the woods at the northern edge of the property, the Harlan Dam was old but sturdy, hand-built, reinforced, and regulated by a steel sluice gate that Thomas alone controlled. As he watched the neighborhood take shape from the ridge above, Thomas felt something tighten inside him. They hadn't asked. They hadn't offered. They hadn't even looked him in the eye. He'd been written out of his own history, replaced by HOA bylaws and smiling realtors. The land beneath those houses had stories, of storms survived, of crops grown, of generations buried. Now, it was a playground for strangers. Weeks turned into months. Thomas filed complaints, wrote letters, and even hired an attorney, but the HOA countered every move with polished legality. They had paperwork, permits, and signatures, even if forged, enough to stall any case for years. He couldn't outspend them. He couldn't outtalk them, but he could outlast them. Every morning, Thomas would walk the ridge trail overlooking the Basin, studying how the neighborhood settled. He noticed how close the homes sat to the water line. He noted how the drainage ditches ran shallow, how the soil, packed hastily during construction, struggled to absorb heavy rain. He observed the children playing near the edge of the lake, the families fishing off the small dock they'd built without permission. They had no idea that the land, and the water, weren't theirs to touch. In early spring, the HOA president, a man named Gregory Barlow, sent a letter to Thomas. It was polite, but patronizing. It claimed that since his dam posed a safety concern to nearby residents, the HOA would like joint access to regulate it. They even offered a modest compensation package. Thomas didn't reply. He didn't need to. He simply folded the letter, tucked it into his coat pocket, and went back to checking the dam. He inspected the gates, the spillway, and the retaining wall. It was all in perfect condition, built by hand, maintained by heart. But Thomas knew something the HOA didn't. The Harlan Dam wasn't just decorative, it was powerful. It held back thousands of gallons of water that, when released, would flood the basin completely. Not dangerously, not lethally, but enough to remind anyone living there that the land had a will of its own. The weeks following that letter changed Thomas. He stopped trying to reason. He stopped fighting through paper and started thinking through soil. Every brick they laid, every car that drove through his land, it all pressed on the part of him that refused to be erased. One evening, just before sunset, Thomas walked down to the dam once more. The sky was streaked orange and red, the reflection rippling across the calm surface of the reservoir. He looked at the homes below, tiny boxes against the green valley, and saw porch lights flicker on. The laughter of children carried faintly through the air. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. As he stood beside the control lever, he could almost hear his father's voice, reminding him that the dam wasn't just a tool, it was a boundary, and boundaries, once crossed, demanded to be remembered. That night, Thomas sat in silence on his porch, watching the lights twinkle where his fields once were. He didn't know yet what he would do, but something inside him had shifted, from grief to resolve. Down in the basin, the new residents slept soundly, unaware that beneath their foundations lay more than concrete. It was history, it was memory, and it was rising. And as the first spring storm clouds began to gather on the horizon, the weight of that history began to stir once more. Spring arrived in Clearwater Valley with heavy rain, the kind that drummed against rooftops like distant applause. The new homes gleamed under the constant drizzle, their driveways slick with water, their pristine lawns already struggling to hold against the muddy soil beneath. The HOA called it seasonal runoff. But Thomas Harland knew better. He had seen that land drink storms for decades. He knew how it behaved when the sky opened up. It wasn't runoff. It was warning. From his porch on the ridge, Thomas watched the neighborhood below transform under the rain. What had once been golden farmland turned into a checkerboard of driveways and gutters. Yet no matter how neatly the HOA had planned their streets, they couldn't plan nature. Water found its old paths, the paths that had been carved by years of flow, by roots and rock and gravity. It seeped under fences, pooled in backyards, and traced invisible lines down toward the lake. The residents complained, of course. Posts flooded the HOA forum about flooded lawns, damp basements, and soggy playgrounds. But Gregory Barlow, the HOA president, dismissed every concern with polished optimism. "We're coordinating with the county," he'd written. "We'll have drainage improvements soon." Drainage improvements. Thomas nearly laughed when he read that line in the local paper. How could they fix something they didn't understand? You can't outvote the land. You can't file an appeal against the slope of the earth. By mid-April, the rain had thickened. Storm after storm rolled through the valley, turning small rivulets into streams. The lake swelled, its glassy surface creeping closer to the new walking trail the HOA had built. Children had once run along that trail, tossing stones into the water, but now it sat half submerged, a narrow strip between two worlds. From his vantage point, Thomas saw it all. The water creeping, the soil shifting, the foundations groaning. But he said nothing. He simply marked each change in a weathered notebook, a record of what the land was reclaiming. Each morning he hiked down to the dam. The path was slick with mud, branches drooping under the weight of rain. The dam stood steady, its old stones glistening darkly. He checked the pressure gauge, the flow meters, the overflow channel. Everything held. The reservoir was near capacity now, higher than he had ever seen it since his father's time. He could release some of it, of course, open the gate a little, relieve the pressure. That's what a responsible land steward would do. But as Thomas stared at the heavy steel wheel, he couldn't bring himself to move it. Not yet. There was something about watching the water rise, a slow, inevitable force that felt righteous. The HOA had claimed his land on paper. Let them now see what it truly meant in practice. As the days passed, frustration brewed below. The homeowners demanded action. The HOA sent crews to dig trenches, lay sandbags, and install makeshift drains. But nothing worked for long. The rain came faster than they could respond. Water slipped through seams, gathered in hollow places, and followed the old creek beds that no blueprint had accounted for. Then came the first real crack, not in the dam, but in the illusion of control. On the last Sunday of April, a storm unlike any other swept across Clearwater. Wind lashed the valley, tearing at shingles and uprooting saplings. Thunder rolled like a warning from the hills. By nightfall, the lake had risen another 2 feet. The walking trail disappeared completely. The backyards closest to the shore turned into shallow ponds. Cars were moved, fences reinforced, but it was useless. The basin was remembering. Up on the ridge, Thomas stood in the downpour, coat soaked, watching the lights flicker below. He felt no joy in it, only a deep, aching satisfaction. It wasn't vengeance. It was revelation. For months they'd lived on his land as though it were theirs, but now the land was speaking back. By morning, chaos had settled into panic. Several homes reported foundation cracks, crawl spaces flooded. One family awoke to find their backyard swallowed by the lake. The HOA called emergency contractors, but every truck that tried to reach the site sank into mud. County officials were summoned, engineers consulted, and surveys redrawn. When Thomas read the latest county update, he noticed something amusing. For the first time, the official topography maps labeled his dam correctly. Harlan Reservoir Control Zone. His name, back where it belonged. Small victories. Still, he knew it wasn't over. Water recedes, bureaucracy rebuilds. So long as the dam held, they could always patch and plan, pretending nothing had changed. If he wanted them to truly understand, to see what they had stolen, he would have to show them. That evening, Thomas sat beside the dam again, the roar of the spillway echoing softly. He placed his lantern down, casting golden light on the slick stones. He traced his hand along the cold steel lever. His father's voice echoed faintly in memory. Never open it fast. It wasn't just a warning about machinery. It was about balance. But balance, Thomas thought, had already been broken. Below, the HOA gathered in emergency session, arguing over responsibility and repair costs. They would blame the rain, the builders, the city. They would blame everyone except the land itself. And so Thomas decided. When the next storm came, he would no longer hold it back. For now, he waited. The rain eased, the clouds thinned. The valley seemed to exhale. But beneath that calm, the water pressed higher and higher, patient as justice. Up in the hills, Thomas closed his notebook. The next entry would be different. The first cracks had appeared, not just in concrete, but in certainty. And when certainty breaks, everything else follows. The storm came without warning. By early May, Clearwater Valley had endured weeks of relentless rain, but nothing prepared the residents for what would come that night. The sky turned a bruised shade of gray, and thunder rippled across the hills like a warning drum. The forecast had called it a moderate weather event, but Thomas Harlan knew better. The air carried that old heaviness, the kind that meant the valley was about to be tested. From his cabin on the ridge, Thomas stood at the window, lantern light flickering behind him. The valley below, once dry farmland, now gleamed with reflected light. Street lamps shimmered on the rising lake, and the newly built homes, neat, proud, and identical, seemed to float on the edge of something ancient and waiting. By midnight, the storm broke open. Sheets of rain poured down, wind howled through the trees, and the hillsides groaned under the weight of water. Thomas pulled on his old raincoat, took up his lantern, and made his way down the muddy path toward the dam. Each step sank deeper into the earth, and each gust of wind carried the sound of rushing creeks swelling with fury. When he reached the dam, the roar was deafening. The reservoir had risen past its usual limits, lapping dangerously close to the top of the retaining wall. The sluice gate trembled under pressure. Water surged against the old stones, searching for weakness. Thomas steadied his lantern and checked the overflow channel. It was holding, but barely. He thought of the 35 homes built below. How they'd appeared one by one, their wooden frames cutting into soil that once fed his family's crops. How the HOA had stood proudly at the ribbon cutting, smiling for cameras, never realizing that every nail they drove sank into a stolen foundation. Thomas had tried to warn them once through letters and appeals. He'd spoken of the soil composition, the slope, the floodplain, all ignored. They had built not only on his land, but on his patience. And patience, like water, could only be held back for so long. He placed both hands on the steel lever. It was cold, slick with rain, unmoved for years. In the dark, he felt the pulse of the land through it, the weight pressing, demanding release. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas began to turn it. The mechanism groaned. For a moment it resisted, as though even the dam itself was unsure. Then came the sound, a deep, grinding rush, and the water answered. At first, it was only a low surge, spilling from the sluice gate in a steady stream. But as Thomas turned the lever further, the stream grew into a torrent. The roar rose over the storm, echoing through the valley. He stepped back, rain soaking through his coat, and watched as the water poured down into the basin. From above, it looked almost beautiful. A silver sheet cascading through the darkness, winding between the trees and into the lowlands where the homes stood. He knew it would not destroy them. The dam wasn't large enough for catastrophe, but it would flood, it would reclaim, it would remind. In the neighborhood below, lights flickered awake. Flashlights darted through windows. Cars started. Panic rippled through the neat grid of streets as residents realized the water was no longer just seeping. It was moving. Driveways vanished first, then sidewalks. The lake, once a tranquil centerpiece, swelled over its edges and began swallowing backyards. Thomas remained at the ridge, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't joy he felt. Not exactly. It was something quieter. A reckoning. For too long, he had been silent while papers, signatures, and bylaws erased his name. But the land had not forgotten. It carried memory deeper than any deed. By dawn, the storm had passed. The valley lay still, wrapped in mist. The new development, Clearwater Ridge they called it, sat half submerged. Fences leaned, lawns gleamed under a shallow sheet of water. Some homes had water up to their porches, others higher still. Cars were stranded, roads impassable. Helicopters hovered overhead by mid-morning, surveying the damage. News crews arrived, eager to capture the flood disaster. County officials stumbled over explanations. They called it a freak event, a one-in-a-century storm. But Thomas knew that wasn't true. The rain had played its part, but the valley's rise had been guided, carefully, deliberately. When the sun broke through the clouds, steam lifted from the soaked earth. Thomas returned to the dam, closing the gate once more. The rush subsided, replaced by the steady drip of runoff. He stood in silence for a long while, listening to the land settle. Down below, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Reports flooded in from angry homeowners demanding answers. Insurance claims, property damage, accountability. Gregory Barlow, ever the polished spokesman, assured them it would all be resolved. But behind his calm tone lay cracks that no amount of paperwork could patch. The next day, inspectors traced the source of the surge. They followed the path of the overflow back to its origin, the Harlan Dam. They noted that it had been manually opened. They filed a report. And though Thomas was never directly named, suspicion began to turn uphill. For the first time, HOA officials arrived at his cabin. They knocked, but no one answered. He stood inside, behind the curtain, watching them leave footprints in his mud. They left a letter nailed to his fence, a formal request for a meeting, written in careful legal language. Thomas didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what it said: discussions, liability, cooperation, the same tone they'd used before they stole his land. That evening, Thomas returned to the ridge. The basin shimmered under fading light, quiet now. The water was already receding, but not forgotten. The families below were learning what it meant to live on borrowed ground. He thought of his father's words again. The land will always speak. All you need to do is listen. And as the wind carried the faint hum of pumps and generators from below, Thomas realized this was only the beginning. They would rebuild, deny, and defend. They would call it misfortune. But the valley remembered, and so did he. The storm had passed, but its silence lingered. For days, Clearwater Valley sat heavy and still beneath a washed-out sky. The roads dried slowly, lawns turned to soft clay, and the scent of damp earth hung in the air like memory. To the residents of Clearwater Ridge, the 35 proud homes that stood upon Thomas Harland S. land, the flood had been a nightmare, a sudden and inexplicable event that upended their illusion of safety. But for Thomas, it was the land simply remembering what had been forgotten. He spent the following mornings walking the ridge trail, boots caked in mud, surveying what remained below. The neighborhood looked smaller now, humbled. Piles of debris lined the curbs. Soggy furniture lay strewn in yards. Temporary pumps worked tirelessly, coughing water back toward the drainage ditches that could never keep up. From this height, it all seemed like a fragile imitation of order. Neat houses, built atop something too wild to tame. Every night, the HOA held meetings in the community clubhouse, their voices carrying faintly up to the ridge through the evening fog. They argued over causes and costs, about who should pay for damages. Some blamed the builders, others whispered about the dam, but none dared say aloud what many were beginning to suspect, that the land itself had turned against them. Thomas knew they would come for him eventually. The reports had already named his dam as the likely cause of the flood. The county had marked the Harland Reservoir as a private structure of interest. The HOA sent letters, first polite, then formal, then urgent. They wanted cooperation. They wanted access. They wanted control. But Thomas had learned long ago, once you let them in, they never stopped taking. He ignored the letters. He ignored the knocks at his gate. Instead, he spent his days reinforcing the dam, inspecting the sluice gate, and clearing debris from the spillway. The flood had tested the structure, and it had held. The Harland Dam was old, yes, but not weak. Built from stone quarried on this very land, it had survived storms, droughts, even small earthquakes. It would endure far longer than the plywood walls of those uniform homes below. As he worked, memories surfaced, his father's calloused hands guiding his as a boy, teaching him how to tighten the bolts, how to gauge the pressure, how to read the water's moods. His father had always said the dam was not a weapon, but a covenant. It was built not to control the land, but to live alongside it, to respect its rhythm. The HOA had broken that rhythm the day they poured their first foundation. The residents, meanwhile, were restless. Some had already begun talking about selling, though buyers were scarce. The flood had tarnished the neighborhood's reputation. Real estate listings now carried disclaimers about potential water hazards. Insurance rates doubled. Property values plummeted. What had once been marketed as exclusive lakefront living was now whispered about as that flooded subdivision. Gregory Barlow, the HOA president, fought desperately to preserve the illusion. He held press conferences, posed beside cleanup crews, and promised improvements. But each word he spoke rang hollow. He was managing a disaster he didn't yet understand, a man trying to bargain with the tide. By mid-June, the ground had begun to dry. The last of the pumps were removed. The residents started to believe the worst was over. The HOA approved new landscaping, higher retaining walls, improved drainage systems. They threw money at the earth, thinking it could be tamed with concrete and confidence. Thomas watched it all unfold. He admired their persistence, even as he pitied their ignorance. They still believed they were in control, that water could be redirected, that nature could be negotiated with. But the basin had its own plans. Late one afternoon, while clearing brush near the dam, Thomas noticed something curious. A thin trickle of water escaping from a fissure in the ridge above. A new spring, born from the storm's pressure. It wound down through the rocks, feeding into the reservoir. The land was shifting again, reshaping itself. Nature was not healing. It was preparing. That night, thunder rumbled once more beyond the horizon. Another system was moving in, smaller than before, but enough to stir the waters. Thomas stood on the dam under the pale light of his lantern, watching the surface ripple with the first drops of rain. He knew now that this was not about one flood. It was about balance. The basin would not rest until it was remembered, fully, fiercely, undeniably. Down in Clearwater Ridge, porch lights flickered on one by one. Families settled inside, trusting their walls, trusting the HOA's reassurances. But the ground beneath them remained restless. Beneath every manicured yard, every freshly planted hedge, the soaked soil whispered a truth too old for bylaws to contain. This land had always belonged to the water. By morning, the rain began in earnest. Light at first, a steady drizzle that thickened with each passing hour. Creeks overflowed, and gutters choked with debris. Once again, the lake began to swell, creeping over its banks. The residents noticed early this time, sending messages through their neighborhood group chat, alerting one another, watching the water inch closer. But Thomas did not move to open the dam that day. He left the lever untouched. He wanted to see how the basin would act on its own, how the land would reclaim what was taken without his hand. It was no longer vengeance that drove him, but curiosity. What happens when history is buried beneath asphalt and then asked to stay silent? As dusk fell, the rain grew heavier. The reservoir reached the spillway, water tumbling freely into the overflow channel. It spread slow and steady, carving its old path back toward the lowlands. The homes glowed faintly in the distance, their reflections rippling on the water's surface. From his porch, Thomas watched in stillness. The air was thick with the smell of rain and pine, the distant sound of alarms echoing faintly from below. It was happening again, not by his will, but by nature's. And as lightning lit the valley, he realized something profound. The land didn't need him to act anymore. It had learned. It remembered. For years, he had tried to preserve it, then avenge it. But now, it was reclaiming itself, slowly, relentlessly. And below, the residents of Clearwater Ridge would soon come to understand. The water they feared wasn't rising against them. It was simply returning home. By the time July arrived, Clearwater Ridge was a neighborhood haunted by silence. What had once been marketed as a bright, family-friendly community now sat heavy under a haze of humidity and unease. The floodwaters had receded, but their mark remained, faint stains along garage doors, warped fences, and lawns that squelched underfoot. Even the air carried a hint of rot, a reminder of all that had been soaked, spoiled, and left behind. The residents tried to move forward. They replanted their gardens, repaired their porches, repainted their siding. But the rhythm of the valley had changed. Nights were quieter, as if the very ground was holding its breath. No children played near the lake anymore. No one trusted the soil. And yet, despite everything, the HOA persisted. Gregory Barlow stood firm in his conviction that Clearwater Ridge would recover. He scheduled new drainage assessments, ordered additional soil stabilization, even proposed a decorative retaining wall around the lake. An expensive gesture meant to reassure nervous homeowners. But reassurance could not disguise the truth. The ground was shifting again. Deep beneath the polished lawns and paved streets, the soil remained saturated. Layers upon layers of compacted earth now softened by weeks of water. Hairline cracks began appearing in driveways. Sidewalks buckled slightly. A few homes developed small fissures along their foundations. The HOA blamed post-storm settling. Contractors patched and poured concrete. But Thomas Harlan knew better. The basin wasn't settling. It was stirring. From the ridge, he watched the transformation with quiet detachment. The valley below no longer felt like the wound it once was. It had begun to heal itself, not by erasing the intrusions, but by folding them back into the cycle of water and soil. The lake was wider now, its edges uncertain. Reeds had sprouted near the shallows. Frogs sang at dusk. The ecosystem his family had nurtured for generations was reawakening, reshaping itself around the human interruption. Still, the HOA refused to yield. They approached Thomas once more, this time not with letters but with officials. County surveyors arrived in bright vests, knocking at his door. He met them on his porch, silent, arms folded. They spoke of community safety, of shared water management. They spoke as though his dam were a civic inconvenience rather than the heart of the valley. He didn't answer them. He didn't need to. Words had built those houses. Silence would bury them. Later that week, the HOA announced their most ambitious plan yet, a drainage tunnel that would redirect overflow from the lake directly into a nearby stream. They called it a permanent solution. Excavators rolled in, cutting into the soil, tracing the path for their pipe. The noise echoed through the valley, metal against earth, engines against memory. Thomas stood at the ridge, watching. He could almost hear his father's voice. They'll dig until they remember why we built the dam in the first place. The dam had never been meant to hold back water alone. It had been built to balance it, to slow the flow, to give the land time to breathe. Now, in their arrogance, they were undoing that balance. They thought they were improving the valley. In truth, they were waking it. Within a week, the first signs appeared. The stream they planned to redirect into began overflowing backward. Water, once calm, turned murky and fast. The rain returned in short, furious bursts, filling every trench they dug. The pipe installation stalled. Workers abandoned the site, and below the surface the soil began to liquefy. By late July, whispers spread among the residents. Strange creaks at night, fences leaning. A garage door that wouldn't close properly because the frame had shifted just slightly. The HOA dismissed them as minor post-storm issues, but unease grew like mold beneath the paint. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Thomas saw something that told him the valley had made up its mind. A sinkhole, small but deep, opened near the cul-de-sac where the newest homes stood. It swallowed a patch of lawn, part of a fence, and the edge of a driveway. The ground there had always been soft, but now it was dissolving. The HOA cordoned it off, called engineers, spoke in cautious tones about subsidence. But to Thomas it was clear the water was returning to its old channels, carving paths that no surveyor could chart. As the weeks passed, more appeared, not large enough to devastate, not yet, but enough to remind, enough to frighten. And then one night, the valley breathed again. It began with a low, distant rumble. Not thunder, but movement. The earth shifted, slow and deliberate. In the center of the neighborhood, near where the HOA's decorative lake path once stood, the ground gave way. Water burst upward, reclaiming what was once a natural spring long buried beneath foundations. By dawn, the cul-de-sac was gone, replaced by a widening pool. Residents fled their homes, watching as driveways tilted, streetlights bent, and the lake expanded into their streets. The dam above remained untouched, steady as stone, its spillway calm. The flood did not come from Thomas. It came from within. Standing on the ridge, lantern in hand, Thomas felt no triumph, only stillness. The land had spoken, not with rage, but with inevitability. Below, Gregory Barlow stood knee-deep in water, shouting orders no one followed. His polished shoes sank into the mud, his clipboard soaked and useless. The HOA, the very institution that had claimed dominion over the basin, was now powerless, reduced to bystanders in the face of something older, truer. By afternoon, Clearwater Ridge was a reflection, shimmering houses mirrored in a pool that stretched farther each hour. County officials called it a structural failure. Engineers spoke of hydrostatic pressure. But Thomas knew it wasn't failure. It was memory, manifest. That evening, as rain began to fall again, Thomas closed his eyes and listened. The water murmured softly below, winding through streets that should never have been built. The frogs sang again. The reeds swayed. For the first time in years, the valley sounded alive, and as the sun disappeared behind the ridge, Thomas finally understood. This was never revenge. It was restoration. The basin was taking back its name. By August, Clearwater Ridge had become a ghost of its promise. What began as a vision of suburban perfection now lay fractured beneath a veil of mist. Streets that once gleamed with fresh asphalt were cracked and submerged in shallow pools. Lampposts leaned at uneasy angles. The cheerful pastel homes, uniform, proud, and pristine, now stood half-sunk in the earth they had once claimed. Their reflections shimmered in the widening lake that no one could control. From the ridge above, Thomas Harland watched the valley in silence. The basin had finally reclaimed its shape, not through violence, but through patience. The lines the developers drew, the maps the HOA filed, the foundations they poured, all of it had been temporary. The land had waited, quietly, until the moment it could breathe again. The county declared the area unstable. Officials arrived with clipboards and concern, their boots sinking into the same soil they once called prime property. Engineers mapped new fault lines, tracing the contours of the earth as it folded back to its natural state. What they saw as damage, Thomas saw as correction. The water had not destroyed. It had remembered. One by one, the families left. Some packed in haste, hauling what they could before the next rain. Others lingered, hoping for compensation, for some last-minute miracle of repair. But Clearwater Ridge was beyond saving. The insurance companies denied claims, citing act of nature. The HOA's funds dwindled. The proud signs that once advertised luxury lakefront living were now warped, half submerged, their slogans mocking in their irony. Gregory Barlow, once the confident face of the community, had vanished into silence. Rumor had it he'd resigned, his home one of the first to crack beyond repair. The HOA, once a force of absolute order, now existed only in memory, a handful of abandoned bylaws drifting like leaves across flooded streets. And so the valley fell quiet. Thomas continued his walks each morning, tracing the ridge as fog curled over the water below. Where driveways once lay, he saw reeds and cattails sprouting again. Ducks had returned to the lake. The frogs sang at dusk. The basin, in all its wild symmetry, was coming back to life. He sometimes thought about the people who had lived there, about the children who played in yards that once grew wheat, about the families who'd built their dreams on ground that was never truly theirs. He felt no hatred toward them. They hadn't known. They'd trusted paper over land, blueprints over instinct. The real trespass had been made long before their moving trucks ever arrived, by men in suits who saw soil as currency. The dam stood as it always had, firm, silent, and loyal. Thomas inspected it often, running his hand along its cool stones. It had withstood everything: time, pressure, and greed. His father's craftsmanship endured. The lever, still slick with rain and age, remained untouched now. He would never open it again. The water no longer needed his guidance. It had found its own course. In late summer, nature completed its quiet victory. Grass pushed through the cracks of what had once been Maple Court. The asphalt crumbled, giving way to soft earth. Trees, saplings at first, began rising through forgotten lawns. The lake's edge extended gently, swallowing the last remnants of street signs. It was as if the basin was erasing human lines, 1 inch at a time. Reporters came once or twice, searching for a story. The vanished neighborhood, they called it. They stood on the ridge beside Thomas, asking questions about the floods, about the dam, about whether he felt any responsibility. Thomas gave them no answers. He only watched the valley, the water glinting gold beneath the sun, and let silence speak for him. Responsibility? Yes, but not guilt. The land had simply reminded those who forgot that ownership is not dominion, it is stewardship, and stewardship demands respect. By September, the last homeowner had left. Their houses stood hollow now, echoes of ambition fading into the sound of rippling water. Windows reflected nothing but sky. Birds nested in open rafters. The HOA's meticulously trimmed lawns had turned into meadows. What once was control had become wild again, and in that wildness, there was peace. Thomas built a small bench on the ridge overlooking the water. It wasn't too much, just 2 boards and old nails, but it faced the heart of the valley. He sat there often, notebook in hand, recording the changes. Each entry marked a new stage in the basin's rebirth: the return of herons, the first fish jumping near the shore, the quiet trickle of new springs feeding the lake. He thought about his father, his grandfather, and all those who had walked this land before him. They had worked with the valley, never against it. They had understood something the HOA never could. That control is an illusion, but balance is truth. One morning, after a light rain, Thomas walked down to the dam. Mist hung low over the water, and the surface mirrored the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He paused, listening to the hum of cicadas, the distant cry of a hawk. The air smelled of cedar and wet stone, clean, ancient. For the first time in years, he felt the valley at peace. The basin had taken back what was its own. The homes, the fences, the signs, they were gone or going. But the land remained, as it always had, waiting patiently for those who would listen. Thomas turned away from the dam and began walking home, boots pressing softly into the earth that now carried no boundaries, no trespass. Behind him, the water shimmered in morning light, calm and full, not a threat, but a promise. The valley was whole again. And as Thomas reached his porch, lantern swinging gently in his hand, he realized that some things are not meant to be fought for, only remembered. In the end, the basin had not been lost. It had simply waited. And when the time came, it had reminded them all. You can build upon the land, but the land will always have the final word.